Elkie Brooks gave me the idea to try lilac wine. It took me a long time to get the recipe right, but get it right we have. And today, we're going to make some. Hello, welcome to English Country Life, welcome to the kitchen and welcome to May on a blustery windy day. Today we're going to make lilac wine. The song is fabulous, and by the way, if you've not heard the Miley Cyrus version of Lilac Wine that she recorded in a garden, listen to it. Absolutely super, properly acoustic, properly full of emotion. Really like her version of that song. Anyway, we're not here to do music reviews, we're here to make wine. Lilac wine is an interesting wine, and I've tried loads and loads of recipes for it. And I've come up with a recipe I'm going to show you today after many attempts that I wasn't entirely happy with. Lilac is a really scented, really heady flower. But flower wines can taste highly perfumed, but kind of thin somehow. And what I wanted was a full-bodied white wine with all those beautiful heady notes, but not something that tasted acidic or over-sweet or over-thin. And I think if you try this recipe, you're gonna like it. It's not a complicated one to make, so let's get going and we'll show you how it's done. As always, we'll put the recipe up in writing at the end of the video. We're going to want 3 to 3.5 litres of lilac blossoms to make this recipe. But I mean the blossoms, not all the woody twiggy stuff. So we are going to just pull off the individual flowers, drop them into a litre jug so we know how many we've got. And when we come across any of these brown ones, we're going to leave them behind because we want the freshest, most open blossoms. Now, lilac comes in pink, purple and white and different degrees of scent. I've never found consistency that, purple ones smell stronger than white ones. It seems to vary plant to plant. And if you find that it tastes too strong for you, either use a less scented plant or less of the blossom. I'm not going to lie, it takes an age to pluck these blossoms off. As you can see, I'm using a litre jug. Just pluck them off, drop the blossoms in as you go and put something decent on your phone or tablet to watch while you're doing it. Mate, I'm watching The Hedgecombers on YouTube, the wonderful Jane Sarche, accompanied by a partner in crime, the fabulous Johnny, who I know from a previous life. Brilliant couple, do superb videos, they do camping, they do cooking, they do farm life. Give them a try, The Hedgecombers on YouTube. That's 3.5 litres of picked off lilac blossom. Yeah, there's a little bit of green stuff on some of them and the odd brown petal, but compared to what's in the basket, much less twiggy material in what we're going to use to brew with. What we've got to do next is get ourselves a vessel to infuse all that flavour into what's called the must, the liquid that we're going to ferment, and we need to sterilise that vessel. In order to thoroughly sterilise a brewing vessel, all you need to do is put about an egg cupful of plain unscented 5% household bleach into the container. Thoroughly fill the container right to the brim with clean, fresh tap water. And then all you have to do is leave that for 10 to 15 minutes. carefully then pour away the water, because it has got bleach in it. Don't get it on your clothes or on your plant. Just pour it away somewhere safely. And thoroughly rinse the vessel. I do it twice. And that vessel is then completely sterilised. Next step, 500 grams of sultanas, roughly chopped. I think flower wines lack what posy people call vinosity. Vinosity is that sort of body that grape wines have. Adding just a small bag of chopped sultanas really fixes that. Yeast likes a slightly acid environment, and there's no acid to speak of in flower petals. So what we're going to do is put the juice of a couple of lemons into our must, just to raise that acidity a little bit, give the yeast a nice environment to work. It also gives a refreshing summery tang to what is a white wine, and that's not a bad thing. Lastly, we'll put on 3 litres of boiling water and give the whole thing a good stir. Let it stand for 48 hours to infuse all those wonderful aromas and flavours into the water. Well, I'd love to tell you that 2 days have gone by, but actually 3 days have gone by. I could have covered that up and said, oh yes, 2 days have gone by, but let's be truthful here. When you live in this kind of life, stuff gets in the way. You get little emergencies, you might not be well, your kids might not be well. And it's a point worth touching on. With homemade country wines, an extra day or two here or there, an extra 10% of this ingredient or 5% less of that ingredient, it doesn't matter much. It really doesn't. Once you've got stuff into the demijohn, my one advice would be, if you're not sure, leave it longer. If your wine's fermented out and you leave it an extra month, it won't come to any harm. If you bottle stuff too soon, then yes, because what's happening is your yeast's still giving off gas, and that can blow the cork out the bottle. So you don't want to do that. So as a general rule of thumb, if you're unsure of something when making wine, leave it a little bit longer. Now, obviously, when you've got stuff in your fermenting vessel, your bucket, you don't want to leave it in there for 3 or 4 months if the recipe calls for a day or two, because vegetable matter in water left for several months will start to go off. But instead of 2 days, if you leave it 3 or even 4, it's really not the end of the world. So don't worry too much about absolute precision. Anyway, 3 days have gone by. Now, today we have to strain off our liquid, our must, into the demijohn. We have to add sugar, we have to add yeast, and we're going to add some stuff called yeast nutrient, because flower wines don't always contain everything the yeast needs. What I'm going to do is make a yeast starter culture, which gets the yeast reactivated, gets it all alive and bubbling and going before we put it into the wine. That gets us off to a racing start. I'm also going to make a sugar solution to add sugar to the wine, rather than to add it as a dry ingredient and then have to try and stir it all up. We'll dissolve the sugar in advance, then add it to the wine. We'll do those 2 things first, then they can sort themselves out. The yeast can get going, the sugar solution gets to the right temperature, whilst we strain off our liquid. So let's get going with that. This is how I make a yeast starter culture. Apologies for people who've watched some of our other country wine videos if you've seen this before, but I think it bears repeating. This is just half a glass of orange juice, and it's at room temperature. Don't use it straight out the fridge. This is general purpose Young's dried active yeast. You can buy it on eBay and Amazon and homebrew shops and what have you. There are many specialist yeasts out there for different types of wine, but for general purpose country wine, get a big old tub of this stuff and it will cover all your needs. This is yeast nutrient. Yeast does need some things other than sugar and water, and the trouble with flour wines particularly is they often don't contain all those nutrients. Now, if you've added some fruit, as we have here, in the form of dried grapes, generally your must will be fine and you don't need the yeast nutrient. But it doesn't do any harm just to add a little bit. So that's what we're going to do this time. And all we're going to do, a level teaspoon of dried active yeast, a level teaspoon of yeast nutrient. We'll mix it up well in the room temperature orange juice. And then once it's all rehydrated and dissolved and even begun to bubble, we can mix that into the wine. There's 1 teaspoon of yeast, and a level teaspoon of the yeast nutrient, which almost looks a bit like sugar actually. It's just a white crystallized powder. Give it a really good stir. I like these long handled Sunday spoons for a lot of things we do in the kitchen. They're very handy, they get to the bottom well. And we'll just leave that aside now for about 15 minutes, giving it an occasional stir. The next step that we're going to take is to make a sugar solution. So rather than putting granulated sugar into our wine, and you can see this stuff that I've got is quite old and gone lumpy. The trouble with putting that into the wine liquid is it's very hard to get it to dissolve. Now, we've only used 3 litres of water on our wine must, and our demijohn will hold over 4 litres. So we can make up a litre of sugar solution, add it to our strained wine must, and still not fill the demijohn. So if we pre-dissolve this sugar, it makes life a lot easier. So for our recipe, 700 grams of sugar. That's not a lot for a country wine, about 1.5 pounds. And we're going to dissolve that in just ½ litre of boiling water. That's actually less volume of water than we've got sugar, but from my beekeeping days, I can tell you, you can dissolve 2 kilos of sugar in a litre of water fairly easily. So this will dissolve very easily. And what I'll then do is add a bit of cold water to cool it down to room temperature. No more than another ½ litre. But you can see already that that's almost dissolved. Here's our liquid. You can probably see that the sort of raisin sultana dried grapes are plumped up, the blossoms have all wilted, and the water's taken on a really nice sort of goldeny colour. So that means that our solids have given up all their flavours to the water. And what we need to do now, strain off the solids, and we're going to do that in 2 stages. We're going to do a coarse straining where we get out the big lumps, and then a fine straining. The coarse straining, just through a sieve or colander, the fine straining through some cloth. We'll start with a spare clean bucket and a large colander. Anything will do though, sieve, kitchen colander, whatever you've got. Something largish with holes in it. Now if you haven't got a steady hand, bail it over with a jug. Finally, once you think the dripping has stopped, take a clean hand and press on your solids. It's not always a good idea to do this in certain types of recipe, but in this recipe, it's absolutely fine, and you want to squeeze out everything you can. That's the colour of liquid you're going to end up with. It's very cloudy. We will show how to clear all this at a later point. But before we carry on, we're now going to strain it through some cloth to get rid of any fine particles. The more particles we can get rid of at this stage, the easier it is to clear later. Here's how we're going to do the fine straining. We take a clean, sterilised demijohn. Just sterilised with a splosh of bleach, filled with water, left for 15 minutes, rinse twice. On top of that, put a large basic funnel. Top of the funnel, we're going to put a sieve, but on top of the sieve, I'm going to put 2 layers of muslin, but any fine cloth will do. And then the muslin will catch little fine parts of liquid that the sieve itself wouldn't catch. Because my target is smaller, I absolutely will use the jug to transfer the liquid across from the bucket and strain it through the cloth. That liquid's now hardly running at all, and the reason that the liquid's hardly running is the cloth is actually choked with sediment. Now we can always move the cloth around. You can see that there's bits off to the side, so when that happens, pull the cloth gently across a little bit and give it a clean bit for the liquid to run through. But before you put the next jugful through, rinse the cloth under the tap, get rid of all that sediment. Now, this may seem a bit sort of painstaking, but trust me, settling that stuff out later will be a real chore. Doing it now is going to pay dividends later. That's what we're left with after 1 litre going through the cloth. I'll rinse that under the tap now and do another litre, and it honestly doesn't take too long, but had we tried to pour it at the very beginning through the cloth, it would have choked instantly with all those big petals and sultanas and whatnot in the mix. So the coarse filter and then fine filter is really worth doing. Trust me on this. Here's our 3 components then. We only added 3 litres of water, if you remember, to our wine must, our liquid, so only 2/3 fills the demijohn. And we did that so we can now add our sugar syrup and our yeast starter culture, and it still won't be quite full. I do that deliberately. A lot of the time with these country wines, the initial fermentation is quite violent, and that means you get a lot of froth. If you fill your demijohn right up to sort of here, which is the full line, that froth can force its way through the airlock. If you initially leave yourself plenty of what's called head space, what that means is it can froth up a bit, and after 3 or 4 days that all dies down, and you just top it up with some room temperature water to the level that you want, and you don't risk that sort of blowing through the airlock. But do take a look. We've got a lovely wine must here. Our sugar's gone clear. You can see a layer of froth at the top of the orange juice that shows that our yeast starter culture is actively fermenting. If you haven't got orange juice, put a couple of teaspoonfuls of sugar in some warm water and use that instead. It'll work absolutely fine. So what we're going to do now, making sure everything is at room temperature, is we're going to add the sugar solution first, and then we're going to add the starter culture to our demijohn. You need a steady hand for this bit. You can see why a funnel is useful. The great advantage of adding our sugar syrup rather than putting granulated sugar into the wine is we know it's fully dissolved. We can see our yeast starter is actively fermenting. Look at those bubbles. Give it a good stir. Make sure you've picked up anything off the bottom. And pour that in. The next step is to give the whole thing a good stir. You can't beat a meat skewer for doing that in a demijohn. Get all that yeast and sugar beautifully mixed up with a wine must. Now you can see here why I said about leave that top space. So our measurements have allowed a good top up with probably 500, 750 ml extra water in a few days once the initial violent fermentation has stopped. Now the last part of our preparation is to fit an airlock. What an airlock does is water in these 2 chambers goes up to about there. As gas pushes its way up, it forces it round into one chamber and then a bubble rises through. And fermentation causes a lot of carbon dioxide gas give-off. If you don't put an airlock in and just leave this open, what will happen is a vinegar fly will come along. They're attracted by the smell of fermentation. It'll settle itself into that liquid. It carries on it something called acetobacteria, and that bacteria will consume all the alcohol in your wine and turn it into vinegar. Now, I make vinegar, and under controlled conditions, that's a great thing to do. But I also like to drink a glass of wine, so I don't want all my wine turned to vinegar. So the airlock, if a vinegar fly tries to get in, it basically drowns in that chamber and it keeps it out of the wine. In a moment, I'm going to put that demijohn on a lovely warm windowsill. And by tomorrow morning, I'll hear a blup, blup of carbon dioxide passing through the airlock, showing me that fermentation is happening. And that will carry on for 2 or 3 weeks. Once it slows down to less than 1 bubble every 60 seconds, fermentation's complete and we can clear and bottle the wine. And that's it. There's nothing complicated. But what you get at the end is a wine you can't buy. I don't care how wealthy you are, it's really, really hard to go out and find lilac wine. And on a summer's day, under a willow tree, a chilled glass of lilac wine is just absolutely incredible. Try it. I promise it really is a life-changing kind of experience. If you're enjoying these kind of videos, can you spare us 5 seconds for a thumbs up down below? And if you want to see more of this sort of stuff, we're just coming up to elderflower season. Now, I've shown elderflower wine in the past, but would you like to see elderflower cordial? How about elderflower champagne? That is something very, very special. Let us know in the comments. And if you want to see these kind of videos, hit the subscribe button down there, the bell icon next to it. You'll hear every time we upload a new video. But whatever you do, come back and see us soon. Take care.